You're sitting in a meeting, or scrolling through emails, or waiting in traffic, and out of nowhere your chest does that thing. A deep pull of air in, sometimes broken into two distinct gulps, followed by a long, heavy exhale that seems to come from somewhere lower than your lungs. You catch yourself doing it and feel a small flicker of embarrassment, because you've been trained your whole life to think that sound means something. That you're bored, or sad, or frustrated, or giving something away about your mood that you didn't mean to show. So you do what most adults have quietly learned to do. You clamp down on it. You turn the deep involuntary breath into a smaller, quieter, more socially acceptable one, or you hold it back almost entirely, and you go back to shallow, unremarkable breathing like nothing happened. I'm not going to tell you that sighing is an emotional release valve you should stop being embarrassed about, even though that's partly true. Before I tell you what's actually happening in that moment, I want to show you something stranger, because the real reason your body forces that breath on you has almost nothing to do with your mood, and almost everything to do with keeping a specific part of your lungs from quietly collapsing while you're not paying attention. Before I explain exactly what a sigh is doing mechanically, and what happens when you spend years training yourself to suppress it, I want to walk you through the actual research, because if I just told you your lungs need you to sigh or they start failing, you'd assume that sounded like an exaggeration built for a headline. It isn't. Some of the researchers who study this consider it one of the most quietly essential reflexes the human body has, one you've been performing roughly a dozen times an hour, every single hour, for your entire life, almost entirely without noticing. In 2016, a team of neuroscientists at UCLA published a discovery that had been decades in the making. Deep in the brainstem, in a cluster of neurons called the pre-Singer complex, the region responsible for generating the basic rhythm of ordinary breathing, they identified two tiny groups of specialized cells, only a few hundred neurons total, whose entire job was to periodically override that normal rhythm and trigger a sigh. When researchers used a targeted genetic technique to silence those specific neurons in mice, something remarkable happened. The mice kept breathing completely normally on the surface, steady, rhythmic, unremarkable tidal breaths, at a completely normal rate. What they stopped doing entirely was sighing. Not occasionally less. Not a smaller sigh. Zero. And within a relatively short window, those mice began showing measurable signs of impaired lung function, because without that periodic deep breath resetting the mechanics of their lungs, small clusters of tiny air sacs deep in the lung tissue were quietly collapsing and staying collapsed, something ordinary breathing alone was never designed to prevent on its own. That finding confirmed something respiratory physiologists had suspected for a long time without being able to prove at the level of individual neurons. A sigh isn't an emotional leak or a random mechanical hiccup in your breathing pattern. It's a dedicated, hardwired, deliberately engineered reflex, controlled by its own specific set of brain cells separate from the ones running your normal breath-to-breath rhythm, and healthy humans perform it involuntarily somewhere between 8 and 12 times every hour, roughly once every 5 to 6 minutes, whether you're aware of it happening or not. You have almost certainly sighed multiple times just during this video without registering a single one of them. Now hold that finding in one hand. A tiny, specific population of neurons exists for the sole purpose of forcing periodic deep breaths, and removing them causes measurable lung collapse in a matter of days. Now hold this in the other hand. A separate line of research, this time in humans, published out of Stanford in 2023, compared several different structured breathing practices against simple mindfulness meditation over the course of a month, tracking mood and anxiety daily. The practice that produced the largest improvement in mood and the largest reduction in physiological stress markers, outperforming meditation and outperforming a slower box breathing pattern, was a technique built entirely around one specific motion, a double inhale through the nose immediately followed by a long, extended exhale through the mouth. In other words, deliberately, consciously recreating the exact motion your brainstem has been forcing on you involuntarily every 5 minutes of your life, on purpose, in a structured way, produced measurable psychological and physiological benefits within days. Those two facts sitting side by side should feel strange, the same way it felt strange that 90-year-olds could still build new muscle tissue. A reflex most people have spent their whole lives quietly suppressing in public turns out to be one of the more powerful, immediately accessible tools for regulating stress that modern research has actually tested and confirmed. Here's the reframe I need you to make, because it changes how you'll think about every single sigh for the rest of your life. It's not that a sigh means you're frustrated, sad, or giving something away emotionally, even though sighs absolutely do increase during moments of stress and relief, which is exactly why the association stuck in the first place. The deeper truth is that a sigh is a scheduled maintenance event your nervous system runs on your lungs automatically, regardless of your mood, to fix a mechanical problem that ordinary breathing creates by default and cannot fix on its own. Treating a sigh as purely an emotional signal is like watching a car dashboard light blink on periodically and assuming it only means the driver is anxious, while ignoring that the light is wired directly to the engine and would blink whether the driver felt anything at all. Let's walk through the actual mechanics of why this maintenance event exists, because once you understand it, you'll never look at an involuntary deep breath the same way again. Your lungs are made up of roughly 600 million tiny air sacs called alveoli, each one an incredibly thin, delicate structure where oxygen actually crosses into your bloodstream. During ordinary, shallow, resting tidal breathing, the kind you're doing right now without thinking about it, you're only using a modest fraction of your total lung volume with every breath. That's completely normal and efficient for resting metabolic needs. But there's a mechanical cost hidden inside that efficiency. Alveoli are coated in a thin fluid layer that creates surface tension, and when they're never stretched beyond a shallow, small tidal volume for an extended stretch of time, a small percentage of them begin to collapse in on themselves, a phenomenon called micro-atelectasis. It happens quietly, continuously, in the background of ordinary breathing, in everyone, all the time, simply because shallow breathing doesn't generate enough mechanical stretch to keep every single alveolus fully open. A sigh is your body's built-in fix for exactly this problem. That larger-than-normal breath, roughly double or more the volume of an ordinary tidal breath, generates enough mechanical stretch across the lung tissue to physically pop those collapsed alveoli back open and spread a lubricating substance called surfactant evenly back across their surface, restoring their ability to expand properly on the next several ordinary breaths. Think of your lungs like a house full of window blinds that very slightly sag closed on their own throughout the day from nothing more than gravity and their own weight. Ordinary breathing opens most of the blinds partway and keeps them there. A sigh is the one motion strong enough to pull every single blind all the way back up at once, resetting the whole system before the next stretch of shallow breathing lets a few of them sag closed again. Skip that reset reliably enough, and more of those blinds stay shut, not because anything is broken, but because nothing ever pulled them back open. This isn't a reflex that simply switches off with age the way some biological processes do. It's a reflex that gets actively, repeatedly overridden by specific, ordinary patterns in modern adult life, and once you see them laid out, you'll likely recognize more than one from your own daily routine. The first is chronic low-grade stress and the shallow, upper chest breathing pattern it produces. Sustained stress shifts breathing toward faster, shallower breaths concentrated in the upper chest rather than deep, diaphragm-driven breaths that fully expand the lower lungs. That pattern doesn't stop your brainstem from sending the signal to sigh, but it does mean your baseline breathing spends far more time in the shallow zone that creates alveolar collapse in the first place, increasing the workload that Reflex has to keep up with. It's the respiratory equivalent of a maintenance system that still runs on schedule, while the wear it's compensating for has quietly accelerated underneath it. The second is social suppression, and this one is almost entirely learned rather than biological. From a fairly young age, most people absorb the message that an audible sigh in a meeting, a classroom, or a quiet room reads as rude, dramatic, or emotionally revealing, so they train themselves to physically clamp down on the motion the moment it starts, converting a full, deep, two-part inhale into a small, quiet, partial one. Do that consistently enough, for long enough, in enough social and professional settings, and you're not eliminating the neural signal telling you to sigh. You're repeatedly cutting the mechanical motion short before it fully accomplishes what it was sent to do, the same way stopping a full stretch halfway through repeatedly, day after day, never quite finishes the job even though you technically attempted it. The third is posture and prolonged sitting, which physically restricts how much your diaphragm and rib cage can expand even when a full sigh signal does arrive uninterrupted. Sitting hunched forward for hours at a desk compresses the chest and abdomen, reducing the total volume your lungs can actually reach even during a genuine, uninhibited deep breath. A sigh that would have fully reinflated collapsed alveoli in an upright, open posture delivers meaningfully less mechanical stretch when your ribs and diaphragm are mechanically restricted by the position your body has been sitting in for the last several hours, which is exactly the posture most adults spend the majority of their waking day in. Stack those three things together, a stress-driven baseline of shallow breathing that increases how much collapse needs fixing, decades of socially trained suppression that cuts the fixing motion short before it finishes, and a seated, hunched posture that mechanically limits how effective a full sigh even can be, and you get a reflex that's still firing on schedule from the brainstem but accomplishing less and less of its actual job with each passing year, quietly, in the background, without a Single dramatic symptom marking the moment it started falling behind. I want to walk through the actual chain of consequences honestly here, because the stakes extend well past feeling a little more tense during a stressful afternoon. Chronic, low-grade micro-atelectasis, the ongoing background collapse of small clusters of alveoli that an underfunctioning sigh reflex fails to fully reverse, contributes over time to reduced overall lung compliance, meaning your lungs simply become somewhat stiffer and less efficient at expanding fully with each breath. This connects directly to something researchers have studied extensively in a completely different context: patients recovering from major surgery. It's standard medical practice after abdominal and chest surgery to have patients regularly use a device called an incentive spirometer, whose entire function is to force a slow, sustained, deep breath, mechanically mimicking exactly what a natural sigh does, specifically because post-surgical patients who skip this practice show measurably higher rates of atelectasis and a higher incidence of pneumonia in the days following surgery. Medicine has been quietly relying on the exact mechanism this video is describing for decades, in a clinical setting, without most patients ever being told the underlying reason a nurse keeps handing them that plastic device is essentially you need to practice sighing on purpose because your body isn't doing enough of it right now. There's a broader longevity angle here too, worth taking seriously rather than treating as incidental. Overall lung function, measured through simple tests like how much air you can forcefully exhale in 1 second, has repeatedly shown up in large population studies as a meaningful predictor of survival in older adults, independent of smoking history, in much the same way walking speed and grip strength have earned their place as simple, low-tech measurements that quietly track something much larger happening throughout the body. A lung system that spent years running an underfunctioning maintenance reflex, accumulating more background micro-collapse than it's fully reversing, is a plausible contributing thread in that broader pattern, even though it's rarely the single headline explanation on its own. And then there's the anxiety and stress connection, which turns out to run in both directions rather than just one. Stress increases shallow breathing, which increases the burden on the sigh reflex, but the sigh itself also appears to actively downregulate physiological stress in real time. That double inhale followed by a long exhale specifically shifts the balance of your autonomic nervous system toward its calming branch, which is very likely part of why sighing shows up so reliably at moments of relief, at the end of a stressful task, right after crying, right after finally putting something heavy down. It isn't only a symptom of relief arriving. It's actively helping produce it. Here's where I need to be direct, the same way I've been direct through this whole video. You cannot force your brainstem to fire more sigh signals on command. That part of the system runs on its own schedule regardless of what you decide to do about it. But you can deliberately, consciously recreate the exact mechanical motion of a full sigh on purpose, several times a day, and the 2023 Stanford research on this is fairly specific about what that motion should actually look like to produce a measurable effect. The technique researchers call cyclic sighing involves a full inhale through the nose, followed immediately, at the very top of that breath, by a second smaller inhale through the nose on top of it, mimicking the natural two-part inhale a spontaneous sigh already performs, then a long, slow, extended exhale entirely through the mouth, roughly twice as long as the inhale took. Doing this for 5 minutes, once a day, was enough in that research to produce measurably better mood outcomes and a greater reduction in resting breathing rate over a month than an equivalent amount of daily mindfulness meditation, which is a genuinely striking result given how much attention meditation gets by comparison and how little most people have ever heard of this specific breathing pattern. Beyond that structured daily practice, the posture piece matters more than most people expect. Simply sitting upright with your chest open rather than hunched forward for a handful of minutes several times throughout the day gives whatever sighs do occur naturally, and whatever ones you practice deliberately, meaningfully more room to actually reach the lower portions of your lungs where collapse tends to concentrate. You don't need a standing desk or a dramatic ergonomic overhaul to get this benefit. You need a few scheduled minutes of genuinely upright posture paired with a few full, uninhibited breaths, rather than permanently working from the same forward-hunched position an entire workday tends to default to. Timing matters as much as technique. The moments when a deliberate sigh does the most good tend to be the exact moments modern habits make it easiest to skip, right when you sit down at a desk after commuting hunched over a steering wheel, right after a long stretch of concentrated, shallow breathing focus work, and right before transitioning into sleep, when the accumulated shallow breathing of an entire day has had the most time to let alveoli settle into their collapsed state. Anchoring even 1 or 2 minutes of cyclic sighing to those specific transition points, rather than trying to remember it randomly throughout the day, is a small structural change that makes the practice far more likely to actually stick. Some people find it useful to pair it with something they already do reliably, taking 3 or 4 full cyclic sighs at a red light, before opening a laptop in the morning, or right after standing up from a desk, so the behavior attaches itself to an existing habit rather than depending on willpower to remember it cold. And the social suppression piece is worth deliberately unlearning, at least in private. The next time you feel that involuntary double inhale building in a quiet moment when nobody's watching, let it complete fully instead of cutting it short out of habit. You're not being dramatic or revealing anything. You're letting a maintenance reflex finish the one job it was specifically built to do. You've probably absorbed, without ever consciously deciding to believe it, the idea that a sigh is primarily a social signal, a way of communicating boredom, disappointment, or exasperation to the people around you, and that suppressing it in professional or polite settings is simply good manners with no real cost attached. There's a kernel of truth buried in that belief. Sighs genuinely do increase during emotionally significant moments, which is exactly why the association became so culturally strong in the first place. But treating the entire reflex as fundamentally a social display, something you can indefinitely suppress with zero downside as long as you're not trying to signal frustration to anyone, misses the mechanical half of the story entirely. The brainstem circuit generating that urge has nothing to do with your audience and everything to do with your alveoli. You can absolutely learn to suppress the audible, dramatic version of a sigh in a meeting without any real cost, quietly converting it into a smaller, silent version through your nose. What matters for your lungs isn't whether anyone hears it. It's whether the full mechanical stretch actually happens, silently or not, rather than being cut short out of habit dozens of times a day for years. I don't want to oversell this, because doing so would undercut everything true I've said so far. Practicing cyclic sighing and maintaining better posture genuinely support healthier lung mechanics and appear to meaningfully reduce day-to-day stress for most people, but they are not a treatment for diagnosed respiratory conditions like COPD or asthma, and if you're experiencing frequent excessive sighing alongside genuine breathlessness, chest pain, or a persistent feeling that you can't get a full breath no matter how hard you try, that combination is worth bringing to a doctor rather than addressing with a breathing exercise on your own, because it can occasionally point toward either an anxiety-related breathing pattern disorder or, less commonly, an underlying cardiac or pulmonary issue that deserves a proper evaluation. This video is about restoring a normal, healthy reflex that ordinary modern habits tend to quietly suppress, not about self-diagnosing or replacing medical care for breathing symptoms that feel genuinely alarming. Think back to that involuntary deep breath you catch yourself taking and instinctively feel a little embarrassed about. It was never really a confession about your mood, even on the days it happened to line up with genuine frustration. It's a few hundred specialized neurons deep in your brainstem, quietly running scheduled maintenance on 600 million tiny air sacs, roughly every 5 minutes, for your entire life, almost entirely without your permission or your awareness, and it has been doing that job since before you had any concept of what a sigh was supposed to mean socially. Picture what's actually on the other side of letting that reflex do its full job again. It isn't just a calmer afternoon. It's lung tissue that stays more fully open and more efficient year after year instead of quietly accumulating more collapsed corners than it reverses. It's a genuinely evidence-backed tool for lowering stress in real time, sitting in your own chest, available for free, that most people have spent their whole lives training themselves to cut short out of politeness. It's giving a maintenance system that's been running quietly in the background since before you could talk the full range of motion it was specifically built to use. The reflex was never broken, and it was never really about your mood in the first place. It's been trying to do its job the entire time. It was just getting interrupted, dozens of times a day, by a habit nobody ever explained the actual cost of. Now you know exactly what that deep breath is really for, and exactly what happens when you finally let it finish.